Hi, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Life with Zach. Today, we're going to focus on another aspect of our local history here in Shenandoah County, Virginia. This episode is going to be about the area known as Elizabeth Furnace, or sometimes Elizabeth Furnace Campground. Now, the history of this site, as used by manufacturing and things, dates to 1836, when Elizabeth Iron Furnace was founded at this site. Now, it was one of several small iron-producing furnaces that existed in Fort Valley and in Shenandoah County. Our geography leads to the presence of several iron veins, or veins of iron ore, in our community. And during the 19th century, a lot of innovative entrepreneurs built small furnaces where this iron ore was exposed on the surface, dug for it, and were able to melt it down and produce iron ore that was then sold for the country's growing manufacturing purposes. Now, unfortunately, with the Civil War, most of these closed down, and then after that, they're not really economically viable the way they were before. But many of these iron furnaces did exist during the early part of the 19th century, a few through the early part of the 20th century. Now, these iron furnaces, like Elizabeth, utilized water power. So Elizabeth Furnace utilized the power of the waters of Passage Creek to power the furnace and the other buildings that were there. Now, initially, it was only open seasonally, but later became open more often. Operations were conducted during the winter months, at first because of the need for labor. And what happened was they actually utilized the local population of enslaved individuals. So during the wintertime, these people were idle because they were primarily used for agricultural pursuits. And of course, crops don't grow in the wintertime. So their local population of people who enslaved these African slaves would rent them out during the wintertime when their labor wasn't needed as much on the farm. And they became a widely used labor force, not only at Elizabeth Iron Furnace, but the other iron furnaces. Later, though, demand increases, and the furnace started to operate around the clock. During the mid part of the 19th century, there was approximately 50 individuals working the furnace on different shifts. Now, this work was often difficult and dangerous. The laborers worked really long hours. Medical care was non-existent, and for the paid workers, wages were low. Of course, for the enslaved workers, there were no wages at all. A community eventually emerged around the furnace. Over time, we see a company office, a store, post office, barracks for the workers, carpenter shop, blacksmith, stables, company housing, all being built in this area. And later in the 19th century, immigrant furnace workers were brought in to work this furnace. They married and mingled with people in the community, forming kind of this new group of people in Fort Valley. However, the Civil War, like I mentioned, really impacted the furnaces. They were a military target, and several were burned by federal forces. Others just ran out of people to work them, since most of the men were off fighting. And then after the Civil War, many of them attempted to be reopened, like Elizabeth Furnace, but more efficient and larger iron furnaces were opening in the country that took advantage of bigger iron ore veins, and these small producers like Elizabeth Furnace were forced to close. But what happens here is in 1913, property is purchased by the federal government as part of what is now the George Washington National Forest. And what's called the Elizabeth Furnace Recreation Area, or Elizabeth Furnace Campground, was opened in 1960 on the site of the former iron furnace. And it is actually home now to what's called the Pig Iron Trail, which is an educational trail that interprets the history of the area's iron furnaces. One of the more interesting things is the contrast between the iron furnace, which would have been incredibly destructive to the environment because it used a lot of wood, so the trees would have been clear cut. to be used as fuel for the furnace, and the environmental damage that came with digging the iron ore and the byproducts that were left and just deposited here. So the early environmental damage that would have happened on the site, and now for it to be part of an area that is part of environmental conservation and stewardship on part of the National Forest Service. So it is kind of an interesting contrast. You can learn about that and the history of the iron furnaces in the area by going to Elizabeth Furnace Campground, the Elizabeth Furnace Recreation Area, and also take advantage of all the other features and natural amenities that are in Fort Valley and at this area. So I hope you've enjoyed the history of this furnace, did a little bit of discussion of the Elizabeth Furnace industry and its use and this kind of its role in the community. If you had, always hit the like button, hit subscribe for all the other local history videos. You can also check out my local history grouping of videos if you want to learn anything more, and stay tuned for others coming out. Hope you have a great day.